So, I am Sarah. I work in Farley Hospice at the moment in Chelmsford. I rotate every year in September around the different hospitals and hospices, doing palliative medicine in Anglia. So that's the life that you have as a doctor to become a consultant. Also, I finished my master's. I share that. It's completely irrelevant to all of you, but I finished. I couldn't say that when we did the spiel, but I passed it, so I'm very happy on that. Um, it's a difficult topic, this. If you've obviously come to the day knowing we're talking about dying, if you find it hard at some point, those online, you can just turn me off. That's no, you can mute me. You can. We can't see the screen, your faces, so you can turn off your camera. Because my presentation is what's currently on the screen. Those of you in the room, if you walk out for a break, that's absolutely fine. All right, there's no problem there. So I am going to be talking about dying well, and I'll start briefly with what the media is telling us, particularly at the moment. This day was planned months and months ago. It's become slightly timely, I think. And then I'm going to talk a bit about dying, what dying looks like in the UK at the moment, and what people say they want from dying, what the public say a good death looks like. Some biblical thoughts on that. And then I wanted to tell you a little bit about palliative care, because I work in palliative care and there can be a lot of misconceptions about what we do. And I thought it was a really great chance just to go, this is what it's actually like. And I think it will nicely continue into Sharon's talk, which I think will also enlighten you on what we kind of do. Questions? There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. I have to say, if I've said something that doesn't make sense, though, please do feel free to ask me if what I'm saying doesn't make sense. But generally, there'll be loads of questions at the end, because I'm really hoping there'll be lots of discussion. Everyone will have their own experiences, which will be different from mine, and I think can really generate great discussion. Same for those of you online. Obviously, you can perhaps put in the chat if I say something and you're like, this doesn't make any sense at all. But there will be plenty of time for you to be asking questions and joining the discussion at the end. So, what day was this? This was just over a month ago. This was an article in The Guardian announcing the assisted dying bill that is going through Parliament on the 29th of November. So this was when the bill was announced. It's that person is Kim Ledbetter. She's a Labour MP, and it's a private member's bill. So I'm not completely up in politics, but my understanding is there's a bit of a weird ballot system where if you're top of the ballot, you get to bring a bill to Parliament, which does sound slightly strange. But there's lots of sort of oddities about our democracy. So just another one to add to it. She won, and she put through this assisted dying bill. It has been renamed, and I've got it on a slide this afternoon. It's not, they're not called assisted dying. But this was what she wrote this was what was written in The Guardian. Someone with a terminal condition, very little time, has only bad options. They can suffer in misery and often great pain as their illness takes their life and dignity, or they can travel to Switzerland, or they can take things into their own hands. Those three are the only options people have. As a palliative medicine doctor, it made me so angry to see that. It's not true. It's not true, but people don't know that it's not true. Yes, some people will have pain at the end of life. Doesn't necessarily mean they suffer in misery. Some people will suffer, some people will be miserable. And as a palliative medicine doctor, I will see the very worst deaths, potentially, almost hopefully, because that's my job. My job is to step in when specialist palliative care is needed. But we all die. It's the one, it's one of those things we're all born, we'll die. And most people don't experience that. Most people don't have this indignity and suffering that means that their only options are to take their lives, either taking it into their own hands or going to Switzerland. It's just not my experience. It's not true. But this is what's out there in the media. I'm not going to be talking about sisters dying in this talk, but I think this really helps highlight that feeling that we want freedom. We need to be able to choose. We choose how we live our lives. We choose how we die, and it's my right to choose to die without suffering. I think that's a lot of the messaging we get from the media, from the public these days, and that's certainly so Dignity in Dying are the biggest campaign group for legalising assisted suicide in this country. They call it assisted dying. We'll talk about that later. But it's all about having your choice and being able to control your death. Dame Esther Ranson, who is another person who's been in the media recently, she has terminal lung cancer and is very much advocated for this. Interestingly, when she started advocating, she should have died by now because of her prognosis. But she hasn't. She's still here and advocating for it. And she wants to decide when her life is not worth living so she can end it. And I just think it's such a messaging. We think lives are not worth it. I don't know what a life that is worth living looks like. Do you have to be in a well-paid job? Do you have to be really, really active? Do you have to be completely free of any dependence on other people? Are any of us completely free dependence on other people? Yeah, it just makes me sad. So that's what our media is telling us. That we need to have control. We need to be our little islands of autonomy, and that's the way forward. And a lot of the public, on first reading, think if that's what somebody who's suffering wants, then that must be a good thing.
So what does dying actually look like, though? We don't currently have legalised assisted suicide in this country. But so this is a photo of, I love this photo. It's a photo of one of my old hospitals from many years ago in London. It's the Royal London. It's the Royal London. I'll name check the Royal London. I think it's I spent the pandemic there actually. So 43, and this is not the Royal London stats. This is national stats from I think just before the pandemic. 43% of all deaths in this country occur in hospitals. It's the biggest location of deaths. About a third of deaths will be at home, and then there's care homes, and then there's other places. But the biggest cohort is in hospitals. We have medicalised death. We've taken it behind closed doors. It's now become if you are dying, you come to hospital to be looked after by the doctors and the nurses, because that's what you need. And that's not necessarily true for everyone. In fact, as someone who has to work in hospitals and hospices, most people come into hospital at the very end of their life. That's not the place they should be. Hospitals are set up to treat your illness. They're really good at this. Hospitals are great, and I'm not hospital bashing. I work as I'm not doing palliative medicine. I also have to do general medicine. So people come in and we find your problem. We use loads of tests. We diagnose it, and then we treat it aggressively. We do whatever is needed. And people come to work in hospitals to save lives, to treat people, to get them better, to get them home. The challenge is when you're not going to get better, and that you're not able to cope with the intensive treatment because you're too unwell. And that complexity of where to go. Oh, but most people I would give this treatment to. Most people I would give. You've got a chest infection. You should have antibiotics. You should have scans. I will give that to you, and that will make you better. To then, for hospital staff to recognise that actually at the time in your life, my antibiotics, the side effects of them are going to make you more sick. Or just simply being in hospital where you don't get a good night's sleep, where we do scan you at 2 o'clock in the morning because that's when the scanner's working and that's when your slot has come up. Where we give you fluids because we give fluids to people, but actually if you're dying, fluids might not help. That's a really hard shift in focus. It's almost the knowledge is there. The knowledge is there. People do know what to do, but that focus to go away from going, I'm trying to fix you, I'm trying to cure you and get you out is really difficult. It's not what they're built for. And that's a good thing, because if you come in and you have a fixable problem, you do really want people to be on a one-track mind of get everything fixed and help get you out. So this dying in hospital isn't great. It's not, I mean, if anyone's been in hospital, it's not as comfortable. You don't have your family with you. The food isn't always great. Food was better at the Royal London than other places I've worked. I won't name them. But you know, it's, and like the London, it's you can't even park your car outside. You have to get the train there because it's in the middle of London. All of these things are difficult. And one of the great wins of medicine is that our life expectancy has gone from 40 years in 1820 to 48 to 81, just over 81 years in 2020. I mean, it is just incredible. Like, doubling life expectancy is a phenomenal achievement of modern medicine, and I will say public health and some other things as well. But you know, modern medicine has had a huge impact on that. So I am not saying that's a bad thing. But what I'm saying is that we live so much longer and healthier lives. We don't have big families anymore because people don't die young, and we don't see death. I'm almost 40, and actually, I haven't ever seen anyone in my family die. I've had family members die, but because of the way we live our lives these days, they've died away from me, and I've seen them in the dying phase, and I've had funerals, but I've not seen them die because I wasn't there, because we live disparate lives. Does anyone, I'm slightly nervous to show this at a Christian thing, but I went with it, so please don't hate me. Does anyone know who that is? Oh, and you all named him. You named him. He who must not be named. So this is for online, if you didn't hear, this is Voldemort from Harry Potter. So Harry Potter will call him Voldemort, but he who must not be named. And what can none of us name? The D word, dying and death. We can't even say it. Oh, someone's passed away, or they've slipped away, they've gone to a better place. I often refer to a better place as going to the hospice, actually. I'm like, oh, they've gone to a better place. It's the hospice from the hospital. But D, we can't say the D word. We can't say death and dying. And I'm going to say it a lot today, because actually the more you say these things, the easier it gets. If we can't even say the word dying, if we never see people dying, how can we manage it? How can we do it well? So the first step, and I will talk about this later, is to actually be able to talk about it, and talk about it when you're not dying. Talk about it along with all of life's challenges. If you're talking about it before you get to it, then when it's happening, it's much easier. And just another few slides on the reality of dying in 2024. So if you're going to die over the age of 75, 77% of people who are dying over the age of 75 will have been in hospital having an emergency admission. Emergency admission just means that you didn't plan it. Planned is when you have your elective surgery and they say you're going to stay in for 3 nights afterwards, or 5 nights, whatever. This is if you've come in via A&E usually, and you've ended up in hospital. My experience of caring for frail elderly people is there will be some people who come into hospital and they have their antibiotics, and it might end up being the last year of life, but they get treated and they come home and they live well, and that was a really good time to do. It was a horrible 2 or 3 days, but it was a real investment in their life. You know, you have those horrible days in hospital, you get better, and you go home and you live well. The reality, though, is it's for a lot of people, we get stuck in a bit of a cycle of trying to get you better. But once you come into hospital, we call it pajama paralysis. We, as hospital professionals, put you in a hospital gown and we put you in a bed, and then you're sick in bed. We then do everything for you. We bring your food to the bed, and you immediately start losing muscle. It's really, really annoying, and don't ask me about the physiology of this, but it takes ages at the gym to build up any muscle mass. But blink of an eye, and it really is blink of an eye in hospital, and you start losing your strength. we also mess with all your medications, trying to do the right thing, but perhaps underestimating that 20 different medications in someone over 75 where none of our drugs are trialed. We don't trial drugs in frail people. We trial drugs in fit 50-year-old men, or 30 to 50-year-old men. That is changing, but that's where our evidence base comes from. Our evidence base comes from healthy, well people having one or two drugs. It doesn't come from, and 20 is not an exaggeration. I meet people on 20. Yeah, some people here are like, oh my goodness, that's how many I'm on. Yep. We don't necessarily trial them. And it's basically being in hospital when you're dying is the message here is that it's perhaps not the best place. And I am going to say it again because I don't want anyone taking this away. Hospitals are great. And if your doctor is telling you to go to hospital, please listen to them. But do feel free to ask questions. You can always ask questions of doctors and nurses, because I think this is one of the reasons we really fear dying, is actually it can be a worse experience the more we medicalize it. Okay, it's going to happen to everyone, and some people really need healthcare professionals and others don't. And just a final slide on this. This just is another one, just demonstrating how much people are coming into hospital at the very end. So the last months of life, they're coming in. And if you're coming in the last month, it possibly means you're going to die in hospital. And for a lot of people, the last place they want to die is hospital. I think any doctor would say it's the last place they want to die. But most people, if you have that conversation, if you discuss what other options are available, hospital is not it. So this was a survey done by Marie Curie, who are one of the big sort of end-of-life charities. 1/3 of dying people were severely or overwhelmingly affected by pain in the last week of life, and 40% struggled with breathlessness. Those are quite scary stats. And I read that and I think, oh my goodness, that is, because that means a huge chunk of people are overwhelmingly affected by pain. And I think this says a truth here is that dying isn't easy. And if I start saying to you, you don't need doctors, you can just be at home, be with your family, hold their hands, that's not true either. Dying is difficult. It's difficult for the person who's dying. It's difficult for the family around them. It's challenging for the healthcare professionals who realise that you as our patient aren't going to survive, and it's so hard being with someone who is experiencing symptoms like this. I have to say, I can't remember where this survey came from. I think some things I would caveat this with is, I think when you say that 1/3 of people affected by pain in the last week, my experience in a hospice is that people come into us in a lot of pain. We will sort that out. We'll sort that out, and then you will die comfortably. So you were in the last week, you had some pain, but we can manage it. Most people's pain is manageable. Some people's is not. There will always be that. There will always be experiences where we haven't managed to manage the pain to a level that the patient finds acceptable, that we think is acceptable, I guess, that we kind of failed in the managing of the pain. And we will talk about this later, but pain isn't just physical. And that your physical pain at the end of life will be impacted by how, your spiritual distress, your mood, by the support you have, by the people around you. And I also think my other experiences is often the dying experience can be more distressing for the person witnessing it than the person going through it. When you're sitting at someone's bedside and you just want the best for them because you love them, you just want them to not be suffering, you want them to be comfortable, then any little thing will feel huge. And I think that memory might live on into surveys. But actually, I think people's capacity to bear suffering is better than you think. And my last one, but before I talk about what people want from dying, is how unfair living and dying can be. This maybe slightly complicated graph is looking, so if you are living in the least deprived neighbourhoods in the country, I forgot to get my little pointer out, might be a benefit to the people in the room. Yeah. If you are in the least deprived neighbourhoods in the country, your life expectancy here is that's well over 80. You're knocking up to like 82 years old. If you compare that to the most deprived, your life expectancy is almost 10 years less. 10 years in this country between how long you expect to live just by where you live. And below, almost starker, is the disability free, I think it's called, life expectancy. And this is basically saying, so it's 70 years down to almost 50. There are inequalities in our healthcare, there's inequalities in where you live, your education, your access, and that impacts your dying. So people in deprived areas are living a long time with disability. That means they are dying, that means they will be dying worse. They won't be dying good deaths because they won't be supportive, because they will have more symptoms, because they're not got the access to care that other people have. And how you die lives on in those you leave behind. And that's where we call it morbidity, comes from with dying. So how you die lives on in those you leave behind. So if you die badly, that will impact your relatives. And we hear it all the time in hospices where people are really anxious about something specific, and that's because that's their experience. And the access to things like hospice care is really patchy. I'll talk about this at the end about who funds hospices, but they aren't equal around the country. So here we're in Cambridge today. Cambridge has got a fantastic hospice about 2-3 miles down the road. That will cover the local area, but go a bit more rural here in East Anglia, and we've got people living in rural coastal towns who are a long way from hospices. I think some even in East Anglia don't have access to hospice beds. They're not technically covered by the hospice. And that means that if they do have something like severe pain or breathlessness, and they can't manage that at home, then they're going to end up in the hospital. So what does a good death look like? So there's been surveys done on what the public say. What do I say is a good death? Pain-free is by far and away. So these are the top 3 from one survey, but pain-free is so far above. It's huge. So people want to be pain-free, so much more so than dying alone. They don't mind dying alone as long as it's pain-free. And then maintaining dignity. Dignity, I like to think of, we all have intrinsic dignity. I think when people say dignity like this, what they mean is that they find it undignified to have someone to be opening your bowels in a pad and just lying in it. And I think we would all say that is undignified for someone to be not cared for. And I think it's one of the things when you come into a hospice is the nurses are so good. The healthcare assistants, the nurses are just unbelievably good at making people feel valued and loved and clean and cared for. So this is one survey. So being pain-free. And then this is a little bit more detailed. I think there's 10 on here. So free from physical symptoms is the top one. Interestingly, effective communication, and a little bit lower, there's awareness they are dying. It's really difficult. As a doctor who works in palliative medicine, I find it not easy. I'd say easy. It's what I do. It's my job. I do it all the time, every day, talking about dying. My colleagues in the hospital, they do very clever things with scalpels, with needles. They use drugs that I don't understand. They have their skills. Then having to communicate with people, things like your treatment's not working. You know, we've tried, or we can't offer you any treatment, or we're going to try some treatment, but actually it might not work. All of that is really difficult, and healthcare providers find it really hard to say you are dying. So it's interesting here that a good death people want to know, but no one likes delivering bad news. Even if you're trained in theory to do it as a doctor, it's still really challenging. Not being a burden, I think, is an interesting one, and one I'll come back to later. But it's one of the reasons people cite in Oregon, in the United States, for assisted dying. It's one of their top reasons is, I don't want to burden my family, which again, I find really, really sad that that's one of the kind of biggest things that people want in dying, is to just not burden others. We are here in community. I'm here to burden Zoe with my appalling tech ideas. So it's part of living, is part of being burdens to each other. This is a photo I took when I visited Israel. Obviously not recently, it was a few years ago now. So I'm just going to move on and talk briefly. I feel like the audience I'm talking to, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this. Jesus was deeply distressed and troubled in the Garden of Gethsemane. His soul was overwhelmed to the point of death. And he died on the cross, which was one of the most undignified, if we're going to call it that, one of the undignified ways of dying. And yet his incredibly undignified death was possibly the most dignified death in history. He transformed dying. So Jesus suffered at the end, and we model our lives on Jesus. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. So Jesus didn't go alone to the Garden of Gethsemane. He took them with him, and he was still distressed and troubled, and he turned to God. So I put it to you that what we hear, even that list of things for a good death, some of them seem quite sensible, and some of them will chime, I think, with what the Bible says. But I think it's worth remembering that when we go back to the Bible, that actually that isn't what we value in 2024, isn't what the Bible has necessarily taught us. The Bible at no point says dying is easy. At least I don't think it does. Let's not say pretend I know every word of it. But it's not teaching us that dying is easy. We look at Jesus's death and know it's not. And then our response to it is to be in community, together with each other. We are called to be burdens on each other. We're called to travel these times together. And accept it. So it was a little bit about Jesus's death. Living, we are temples for God's Spirit. And I think it's just worth remembering that we are temples for God's Spirit, not just when we're well and we're going to work and we're looking after our families. We're temples for God's Spirit when we're also lying in bed, when we're ill, right up to the very end of our lives. And that is incredibly precious. And I think the preciousness, the importance of us as humans cannot be understated. And I've said this already, we're called to share in his sufferings. I wish that wasn't the case. That might make it easier. But actually, if you think back to your own lives, there will be times when you've suffered and you have drawn closer to God. And maybe there have been times when you've suffered and you cannot see the point of it. But we are called to suffer and to suffer alongside him. So trying to eradicate that completely, I think, is not what we have been taught. Doesn't mean that we don't try and help. I'm just saying, I think the focus should be that we are trying to come alongside, try and compassionately help people, to love them, to love our neighbours, and be that with prayer or practical assistance, a listening ear. It's not to try and eradicate that suffering. There we go. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And acceptance. Acceptance is not the same as giving up. And I think it's important to talk about, when I've talked about medical treatment, there are really difficult decisions that have to be made at times in people's health journeys. A really easy example is, do I have more chemotherapy? And you can accept where you are. You can accept that perhaps your cancer is incurable, and you think that chemotherapy is the right thing for you to hopefully extend your life so you have more time. That's acceptance of where you are, and that's also consistent with being a Christian, that you can accept the incredible medicine that we have to hopefully extend your life for as long as possible. It can also be the right thing as a Christian to recognize that you are dying, to go, I don't think I can cope with another round of chemotherapy. I don't think I can cope with the hospital visits, the symptoms. And actually, I'm going to focus now on living as comfortably as I can for the time I have left. And that, I've just put it in a kind of binary. There are also shades of grey in between. And it is really, really difficult decisions to be made, which is another reason we should be talking about these beforehand. And it's a reason I will always say, question your doctors. Feel free to ask them questions when they're offering up options like this. So I just want you to not hear that medicine is bad. It is perfectly consistent. I find, as a doctor who has spent years studying, doing all my exams, medicine is absolutely consistent with being a Christian. It's partly about what we're trying to achieve. And that's really difficult to understand as a person, and it's really difficult to communicate as a doctor. So these are challenging scenarios we live in. Dying used to be much simpler. Once you were dying, and it often was quite quicker as well. We've extended dying because you can have palliative chemotherapy and extend it. So it's got more challenging. We not only have the media telling us that we need to have control, we also just have this much longer phase that we have to navigate. For some people, they know they have a terminal diagnosis for almost a decade. That's huge to live with something like that. Has anyone heard of this? In the 1400s, the Catholic Church published this booklet, and it was how to prepare for dying. So this was when dying was a bit simpler because there wasn't any medicine. It went into 100 editions and translations in most European languages. I can't even fathom that. I can't really understand how, without the internet, you get your book published in 100 translations or in different editions, or 100 editions and most European languages. I can't. I mean, it's just, I have no words. The book spiritualized dying, and it described 5 temptations people who are dying face. And I think it's useful to see where our attitude to dying has come from. And the temptations were a lack of faith, despair, impatience, vanity, and greed. And the way to die well, so a good death, was to fight the lack of faith, the despair, the impatience, the vanity, and greed, and that you fight them with their kind of opposites. That was in a time when people died all the time at home, probably slightly quicker, without any doctors around. I think it's a really helpful thing to look back on and just remember that none of those things actually talk about. I get like, they're much more spiritual. So the despair, the fear, the wanting it to be over. Why is it me? We don't talk about that anymore. And there's a big clue. We're going to talk about it in a moment. So I won't, because this is Sharon's field much more so than mine. Because we as doctors take over the conversation, they put me first, so I got to talk about all the tablets and stuff, but Sharon gets the final say. So we're just going to talk, I'm going to let you watch a video now, have a little break from me talking. It's just 5 minutes. It's from the, so it's the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death. Lancet are a big science publication. They did this huge piece of work looking at the what value there is in death. And actually, just saying that, well, what value is there in death? You kind of think it's just a bad thing. And yes, death is part of living in a fallen world. But there is some value in there. And actually, I think we've lost some of that value, and that's what this video is about. So I will just come off the slideshow for a moment.
What happens after you die is changing. You could become a firework, or even have your ashes scattered in space. You could choose to come back to nature with a woodland burial. Maybe you know what you want after you die, but how about before then? Death and dying are much more complicated.
These are issues that are going to affect all of us, and at the moment, the way we're dealing with them is leading to increased suffering. People are having treatments they don't wish to have, families are not involved, conversations are had too late, people are not getting pain relief, people are dying alone. These are real urgent issues that are happening now.
When we talk about caring for people who are dying, this is more about life rather than about that one moment of actual death. We'll say wise things like we'll cross the bridge when we come to it. But this is not an easy bridge to cross.
Dying in the 21st century is a story of paradox. Some of us are overtreated in hospitals as family and community are pushed to the margins. Others are left to face death all alone.
Most discussions are centered around high-income countries. The suffering in low and low middle-income countries is simply invisible.
It's tough even for me. Her whole body is in pain.
We now can do better.
In Kerala, India, state reforms alongside engagement with families and thousands of volunteers is pioneering a model of compassionate communities, changing how people live and die.
She says, sit down. She's saying she's much better. This is Lata Kumari, whom we saw last evening. Looks so amazingly and so happily different.
It was kind of everything I hoped I would find somewhere, and it was amazing actually finding it, because they really were creating this whole new model of care, changing the way people cared, the way people died, the way people thought about death and dying.
Across the world, groups are challenging norms and rules about caring for people at the end of life, and bold new models of compassionate community action are emerging.
What inspires me is knowing it can go right. It doesn't happen by accident. But when I see it happening in living rooms, in bedrooms, in care homes, in hospitals all around the world, it's really inspiring. Because although it doesn't take away the sadness and the loss that is so significant, it does take away the stress, the anxiety, the fear that so often just compounds these times.
Allowing the community to come in means training them, answering all their questions, and sometimes being questioned. It means giving up some of my power as a doctor. Engage them as partners.
The Lancet Commission on the Value of Death convened experts in health and social care, philosophy, economics, and theology, working with community activists to set out the principles of a realistic utopia, a new vision of how death and dying should be.
What we're talking about in the Commission is whole systems change. It interfaces with healthcare systems, with the law, with policy, with education, all of those. Death and dying are social issues And at the moment, we're trying to solve them with a medical lens, and that's what needs to change.
We need to talk about what we want for ourselves when we die, and what choices we want for society.
If we want vaccination done across the country, we have a vaccination drive. Maybe we need to have conversation drives in every country. If we talk about this openly, confront the issue, we'll be able to avoid a lot of needless suffering, needless treatment. I have prepared my advance directive. I have indicated that in the context of an incurable illness, I should not be subjected to inappropriate life-prolonging treatment, partly because that will only be suffering for me, partly because I will be isolated and separate from my family, but also because out of loyalty to me, my family may destroy themselves with that needless treatment. That's a precious time when I should have been receiving a kiss on my cheek from my grandchild. It can be a time of healing also.
We can learn lessons about death from many different cultures, and from the innovators who are showing us new possibilities for the future of death and dying.
You only get one chance to do this. I heard a lot of people say, I wish I knew what they would have wanted. The conversation ahead of time is actually something you can give to those around you, and the gift that they can give back to you. Death it's not just a physiological event at an end point, it's so much more than that.
The realistic utopia starts with each of us facing this, bringing life back to death. It's about leaving a legacy, talking about those we miss, and finding a way through all the sadness to show up for those whose time is short.
Let me clarify that we were not really talking only about death. We were talking about life. What holds meaning in your life for you?
They put it so much more eloquently than me. I feel like that's my talk in 6 minutes. Just okay. When I listen to that video, I hear they talk about dying well is living well, and their dying is hard, but it's not all bad. And I will share two brief stories from my experience. My mother-in-law never had a close relationship with her mum. They just weren't close. When I got married to my husband, my mother-in-law had already been diagnosed with dementia, and her and her husband, my husband's grandpa, they'd moved into a care home together to be looked after. And she wasn't well enough to come to our wedding. So we decided to have a small ceremony at their care home. They had a little chapel there. And we had this ceremony about 2 weeks after we got married. And actually, my husband has a close cousin who couldn't make our wedding either. So they came along to that, which was nice. And I wore this shawl of hers for it. And she was always a woman who was very private and very kind of prim and proper. And my father-in-law is a vicar in the Church of England, so he was sort of leading our little gathering together. And I think it was when we were singing a hymn, she just suddenly stood up. I mean, there was only, I don't know, 10 of us in the room. It was very much a very small family gathering. She just stood up in the room and she was behind me in the seat and she just clasped her hands together in absolute delight. And then she gave me a hug. And it was socially not the correct time. You don't interrupt things when you're in mid-flow. And it was just wonderful. And for me, it was a really precious moment in our relationship. I hadn't known her for very long, and she didn't live for that much longer after that. But it was a really special day for all of us. And actually for my mother-in-law, so her daughter, their relationship in that time of her having dementia, they were the closest they had ever been in their lives. Because when the goalposts change and shift, it allows your priorities to change. It helps you focus on what's important, and it sometimes does force these conversations, and actually you can still see real growth in relationships and fixing of relationships. I see a lot. And the other thing I wanted to share, again, it's my family. My father-in-law this week retired as a Anglican vicar, and in the summer, it was spring actually, someone from his congregation was dying and they're in hospital. And he was in hospital he was going to be in hospital for I think it was his 80th birthday. And they're a good Anglican group, so they made a rota people. I go to Pentecostal church, we don't have rotas anymore. They made a rota so that someone from church, because he didn't have any family, none at all, but he had his church family, and someone from church was always with him. And for his birthday, they made a cake. And I think he only died about a week or two after his birthday. But for the birthday, they all came in at the same time. Everyone who was coming in, they're all around his bedside, and they had this chocolate cake, and he had a slice. And then someone was like, anyone going to have a second slice? And he's like, I can have a second slice. I'm dying. And he loved it. There were like things he loved in life, were God and chocolate cake. And funnily enough, I was back in my hometown only about a week after he died. And I went to visit my old house group leader. She was one of the people on the rota. She told me the exact same story as my father-in-law did. And both of them, when they got to this point, their faces just lit up. And I was like, there is value. There is value in that time of dying. It's not easy. And it took up time. You know, they were on a rota. They were having to make time to go to the next town to visit him in hospital. But it was precious. It was precious good time. So do ask yourself, and importantly, that gift, ask others in your churches, go back from today and say, what's important? Talk about what you want at the end of your life, what really matters to you. Yesterday, I was having a chat with one of the counsellors in our hospice, and she said to me that her and her daughter were out with they were out with family friends, and a song comes on the radio. And they're like, oh, that's your funeral song. And the group just went, oh. And because this counsellor's daughter's about 16, so she's a teenager. And they're like, you've talked about your funeral song. And it's like, it's not going to make it happen. Talking about it doesn't make dying happen. And what it does mean, also, your parents are going to, hopefully your parents will die before you, because that's generally the natural order of things. And actually talking about it means that's one less decision. When her mum dies, she knows what song it is. I had the conversation with my husband. He went, well, I don't really mind. And I was like, oh no, please choose one, because my husband's really musical and I didn't want to choose a bad song. Even though he was like, I'll be dead, I don't care. Because that's his attitude is, it doesn't matter. But I was like, please, can you just use the song? Just the song, everything else I can cope with, not the music. So Compassionate Communities is a charity. It's about enabling the communities. They talked about that in the Lancet Commission. But we as church, we are communities. So yesterday in my hospice, my son's head teacher turned up, and I was a bit like, oh, is my son that naughty that he's come to find me at work? He had not come to visit someone. And I walked into the office and went, oh, my son's head teacher's here. And my colleagues went, oh, he's the teacher who's in the church congregation of patient in whatever bed. And I'm like, oh, how do you know? And they're like, because we talked about it this morning and how valuable his church community was. And people who don't go to church really struggle to comprehend the idea that we would give up time for other people who are not in our family or aren't our close friends, and really dedicate ourselves. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of those out there who are shining that light for being a bit different, because it is a bit weird and a bit different. You do see really good friends who are not in church families. You see that as well. And it always makes my heart warm to think that like a neighbour is really stepping in if someone's not got close family. But churches do it really well. So just keep doing that. Does anyone know who this is? The clue is slightly in the bottom of the screen. It's Cicely Saunders. She founded the hospice movement. I'm just checking my watch. Oh, thank you. She founded the hospice movement. So in the UK, we talked in the video, I meant to say, they talked about the disparity in dying globally, and it's not really my area of expertise, other than to say that the UK is world leading in our palliative care. And they talked about taking it out of doctors' hands. Well, I'm going to take it back into doctors' hands for my last little bit, just to share with you a little bit about palliative medicine, but actually more palliative care. So everyone's supporting. But Cicely Saunders, she was triple trained, I can't even say it, as a doctor, a nurse, and a social worker. And basically, she saw this gap where people, particularly with cancer, were dying and weren't getting the best care. And she, before her, there were hospices, and they were Christian. They were often orders and under like religious orders. But she transformed it into where we are now, where it's much more evidence-based. I believe there's a chapel in the hospice she worked in, and I think she prayed every day in there. She has absolutely transformed palliative care. This is not my hospice. Is it yours? Do you know, I thought this, this has been in my slides for ages. It's just a random one I took off a random hospice website of somewhere local. I basically didn't want to have to bother sharing my employers where they work. So I just picked somewhere else, but I picked one that's represented today. So it's also pretty. I think this was one of the others. So top marks, because all hospices have got nice gardens. So if you've made it on my slideshow, you've probably got one of the best gardens. I just wanted to say, a lot of people won't have been in a hospice. They are delightful places. They normally have gorgeous gardens. They are full of life and light. There's a lot of laughter. Yes, people die there, but they are not dark, shadowy places of, it's not somewhere you hide from the truth. It's where people come to live. So I just want to share a little bit about palliative care, because people often don't understand. And I think it's your chance. You've got a palliative doctor in front of you. Feel free to ask questions on this. Palliative care can be in hospital. So there are hospital palliative teams. And actually, I did talk a lot about how bad it is to be in hospital. My first job as a palliative doctor, I was on a palliative ward in a hospital, and people died well with us. It is not impossible. It's perfectly possible in hospital. It's just perhaps easier to die well, not in hospital sometimes. And sometimes it's the only place you can die is hospital. Palliative care is holistic. So it's not just me with looking at your physical symptoms and giving you tablets. I do a lot of that. But it's also looking at your social situation. Do you need extra support at home? Do you need equipment? Who's around you? Do you just need someone checking in on you every week? There's a thing called compassionate neighbours, where people like have an arrangement where they drop in, say, once a week for a cup of tea, because people end up isolated because they're living so long and other people die around them. Your spiritual needs. we will talk about that more later, so I won't go any more into that. But as it's one of our kind of main areas. And then psychological. What are your fears? What are your have you got anxiety about pain? Have you got low mood? It all comes together, and that's why the palliative team is huge. You've got your doctors, your nurses, your counsellors. I didn't put chaplains on there. How embarrassing. And I think basically the point of this was I just did it so the font size didn't get any smaller, and I was like, that will do. There's a lot of different people involved who can support you at the end of life. And just a bit about the hospice inpatient unit. It's a fraction of what hospices do. So I work somewhere that's got 8 to 10 beds, can't quite remember off the top of my head. Some places only have 4 or 5, some have up to 18. But it can be somewhere that people are really scared to come. So just to be really clear, that some people will come for the end of their life, that you might be what we call commissioned to provide care for the final 2 weeks of life-ish. It's always a bit of an estimate. But there are other reasons people come to inpatient units. So some it will be respite. It's a chance that you live with an illness that is life-limiting. So you will die from it at some point. You have care needs, and you or your carers just need a break, or they're going on holiday or something. You can come in. And then the other massive thing we do is symptom management. So you are living, say with cancer, and you have pain that's we're trying to change your medication at home, but it's not quite working. We bring you in for a couple of weeks with the aim to fiddle with your meds on a daily basis. We've got nurses who can kind of observe. It's safe, and then you can go back home again. And that is a huge part of what we do. So if someone says hospice, it doesn't necessarily mean you're at the very end of your life. It does mean to come into a hospice, you will need a life-limiting illness. And then bigger than that is bigger than the inpatient unit. There is so much that the hospice does. So events, community cafes, both in the building but out in the communities, because they will serve vast geographical areas. Support groups. It might be for those who are bereaved. It might be for those with a specific illness. They will kind of come in hubs at your hospice. Hospices also will be contracted to provide carers in some places. So carers who come out perhaps twice a day to help with, as you aren't able to look after yourself, to kind of help your family. So you're at home, but your family gets to be a bit more family, and then the carers can come and do that. The specialist nurses, those nurses who've trained for like decades, to care for you, to give you medication, they will come out. And a lot of it also is just awareness. Lots of places do like a will month where they're like, please get a will. So from the hospice community, please get a will. I have a will, and I've had it for a long time now, but people are often surprised. I'm like, why not? If it makes it easier for my family when I die, of course I want one. So just to say there's a lot. My last place had a men's shed. I don't entirely know what they do there, but I'm guessing they use tools, and they did build. Yeah, I feel like the men are like, we know what they do. My hospice, we do a lot of bereavement groups and cafes. Cafes are a bit more of a feminine place to go. You have your cup of tea and your biscuit, and you sit around. So they're moving bereavement groups they want to move into pubs, so that they can capture those people who are like, I'm not going to a cafe at 11 o'clock in the morning. That's weird. To try and meet the community with their needs. Give or take. So beginning of life, your care is paid for by the NHS. You go in, your birth care is paid for. Hospices, roughly 30% of funding comes from NHS commissioning. So the NHS will pay the hospice to provide it. It varies around the country, so that's just a rough estimate. The rest of it is coming from the hospice. That's why they have to fundraise. So to provide end-of-life care, to do all of those things that I just said, that needs to come there. That's why they're all charities, or most of them. There are some that aren't. Final 2 slides, we're coming into land. I realised I was in a meeting the other day, and I realised I needed to do this, just to be really clear that we support you with your symptoms. We support you as a patient. We support your family. We really like talking about the future. So we'll be like, what do you want when you die? And you're like, oh, I've never, ever spoken or thought about that. We're like, that's what we're here for, is to open up those conversations. We are here to help you live well until you die. That is what hospices do. We don't hasten death. Anyone who says that, it is not true. No one in the UK is legally able to do that. People think we do. People think that when we start what's called a syringe drive, which is a box about the size of the microphone, to deliver medication because you can't swallow, that's not to hasten your death. That is to control your symptoms. We also don't prolong death. We are there to support you as you're dying. Dying is out of medicine's control. That's one of the challenges us as doctors find about it, is that we can't do anything about it, but we can support. Everyone leaves in a box is what people say to me all the time about the inpatient unit, and they're always a bit surprised when they come in and don't leave in a box. So yeah, I wanted to finish with that, and do feel free to myth bust with me, particularly over coffee for people who are in here, because it's your chance to speak to a palliative doctor. And then my final slide, just some books that I recommend. So With the End in Mind is one that I give to every junior doctor that rotates through our service. It's or resident doctor, if you're up with your politics in the news. It's not a Christian book, but Catherine Mannix is a retired palliative consultant, and it's absolutely excellent. Her second book, for those who are in the room, Listen, is on the table. Both absolutely excellent books. John Wyatt, Dying Well, absolutely fantastic, wise Christian doctor who was a neonatologist. Really so much more than I've managed to do in an hour today. So I highly recommend that. And then How Should We Then Die is a new book from a Canadian doctor about the kind of Christian response to physician-assisted death, as they call it, or physician-assisted suicide. So yeah, just my final three, but I'll leave them up actually. Oh no, because we're going to go to questions, aren't we? So probably better that I end the show. I'll leave it there for a moment. So that's me done, and now it's time for some questions. We've got